All right, welcome to the first session of our Prelude to Roman History seminar, which I guess I could have called Discourses on Livy because that's kind of what we're doing. So in this seminar, we're gonna do 5 sessions. We're doing Livy's first book, so there's 5 books. I mean, Livy's first pentad, I should say. So we're gonna do one of them on each, and then alongside it, we're reading 2 other texts that are about that are a reception of Livy. The first is Machiavelli's famous Discourses on Livy, and the other one is Michel Serres' Rome, which is a close reading of the first book of Livy. So it's not really possible to read these things together and have them match up exactly because Machiavelli is talking about stuff that happens later, and Michel Serres, his entire book is just about the first book and everything. So, but part of that, I think that's a tension that is germane to what we're trying to think about here, which is about historical temporality and our relationship to the past, right? So I think we can go through these works that are operating at slightly off temporalities to each other and see what we can kind of learn from sitting with that difficulty. Anyway, that's my apology for the fact that the syllabus doesn't exactly all line up with each other. We try to turn bugs into features. So anyway, so I want to start off by talking a little bit about kind of placing this seminar in some broader context of things that we've been doing as part of this members school project. Since we got some veterans of the seminar here, and we also have some new folks. So I want to talk a little bit about that, and then I'm gonna offer a few reflections about the different texts that we have, and then I'm gonna open it up, right? So it's not I am excited to hear what you all had to say about it, and I encourage you as you're reading the text, try to bring something to the seminar, something that you thought was interesting, or it could be something you don't understand, like what the hell is Michel Serres talking about here? This passage is weird and I don't understand it. Anyway, so okay, so first. Want to just kind of place this in broader context. So this here, in a way, I'm really excited to be kicking this off because we're returning to kind of the main trajectory of this seminar that I started giving 3 years now ago, I guess it was. So we started off with a seminar called Turbulence as a Political Economic Problem. That one has been lost to the archive for a few different reasons. So I think we may give that one again. We may revisit some version of that syllabus. But that course was basically about the problem of where social instability is located at the interface between endogenous and exogenous processes, right? So on the one hand, we have social or political instability that comes from the outside, like climate change. And on the other hand, we have sorts of instability that come from the inside, like financial crises. And we were trying to kind of think about the way that those kinds of things are related. And we're going to be returning to that theme in today. So that's why I'm just sort of briefly pointing out, right? That in many ways is why we're interested in Livy, because there is a war on the inside and there is a war on the outside. And what we're wondering about is what's the connection between them, okay? And this matters because, for reasons that I'm going to try to draw out as we go on, that is the fundamental problem of money and monetary politics, is the relationship between the social war and the imperial war, okay? And Livy is the place where we need to go in order to look for this. Okay, so in this seminar, we're just going to be reading these texts, and so part of it is I know people may not know much about Rome, so we're trying to lay some foundations of just kind of getting a general lay of the land. The reason I called it the Prelude is that I hopefully if people are interested, if there's interest in the seminar, I'd like to keep teaching Rome for as much as 3 more years, and the reason for this is that my next book is going to be in large part about Rome and Roman monetary history. It's something that in my dissertation is in the last chapter. It's kind of gestured at very briefly because I originally intended to go there and kind of got distracted by James Stewart and ended up writing a lot about James Stewart. But I had to close the parenthesis that I opened with, and it ends with Rome. And so I think there's a good chance that, so I've had some interest from an academic publisher that I won't name, but hopefully that dissertation will be becoming a book in the nearest future. And I suspect that what might happen is chapter 4 might fall onto the cutting room floor, and that they might want a more tightly focused book about James Stewart, which is the part that's really kind of done. So that means that I need to write another book that's going to be about Rome, and well, really, it's going to be about monetary history from Croesus of Lydia, who is the first bimetallic monetary reformer in world history, and who is the central character of the beginning of Herodotus. So we might do a Greece. We'd be looking backwards from where we are now, but we might look at that all the way from Croesus to potentially Charlemagne, who lays the foundation of the modern European monetary system at the turn of the 9th century AD, in the aftermath of the collapse of Rome, right? So obviously, so what's in between there? Well, it's the history of Rome and Rome's money. And the Roman monetary system is the foundation, not of all money, because not of all money, because first of all, there's the New World, and there are monetary phenomena in the New World that we will at some point want to think about. But also, not China. China is its own system. But the Roman monetary system is the foundation of the monetary system of both Europe and the Muslim world, okay? Which put together are a big chunk of monetary history. The Islamic monetary system is ultimately derived from the Roman monetary system, specifically the late Roman monetary system in Byzantium. So not all roads, but many roads lead to Rome. So what I think we are going to try to do is do a 3-part dive into Roman history. We're going to do a seminar on the early republic, which is kind of the material that we're looking at here. Then we'll do a seminar on probably Julius Caesar and aftermath. So basically the development of the Principate. So or what most people would call the Roman Empire as opposed to the Republic. Okay. But here's the first thing that we're going to learn about Rome is that that's not a great way to divide it up, because they refer to different things. And the Republic has an empire, and that's what we're going to be looking at partly here, right? So rather than divide up Roman history between the Republic and the Empire, we need to realize that Roman Republic has an empire. The Roman Republic is an imperial state formation, okay? And the real division is between the Republic and the Principate. Okay, and then there's a later, I've forgotten there's another word that Roman historians use for the later Roman emperors other than the Principate. It escapes my notice at the moment. We'll get there when we get to it. So I think we'll probably do Republic period, which is in many ways going to be about the Punic War. Okay, because it's the Punic War, the war against Carthage in the 3rd century, that is really where, well, that's where a lot of the problems that Livy, as we'll get to in a moment, is reading back into the beginnings of Rome, get started. It's the Punic War, when essentially the Roman state builds and throws away 3 fleets in quick succession. Okay, so they build a fleet, they lose it, they build a fleet, they lose it, they build a fleet, and that one stays floating, right? And they finally win the dominant. Thank you, Jade. The dominant is the one after the Principate. So there is a naval conflict, and one of the themes that we're going to see as we examine this history, whether it's the Greek history, the Roman history, is that monetization processes and naval power often go together. Okay, it's true in British history too, right? Ethelred II presides over a very intense state money system in Britain. Why? Well, because he's building a fleet that he then loses. So anyway, so the Punic War is both the origin of, or the origin, is what seals the deal on turning the Mediterranean into a Roman lake. And it involves a buildup of naval power, a transition of a land power to a naval power, and it goes along with political conflicts over monetary systems and the public fisc. Okay, so it is after the Punic War that the Roman plebs became immune from taxation. So a fiscal relationship between the Roman state and the plebs was actually severed Why? Well, because the Rome is developing a different relation to its tributary provinces, right? So the revenues are now coming from tributaries, no longer from the plebs. This was a major object of anxiety among Roman historiographers like Livy, who are looking back into their own past in order to find out where their problems came from. Okay, so anyway, so we're going to look at the Punic War. Then we're going to look in the next seminar, we're going to look at Julius Caesar and the first century, basically Caesar to Nero, basically. So Caesar is the first to introduce a gold coin into the Roman monetary system. I'd recommend if you haven't read my dissertation, I'm going to be talking about a lot of this stuff, and I can't explain it all. So if you haven't read it, go check it out. This has parallels to the 14th century English history that I examined in the dissertation, which is that Edward III introduces a gold coin into the English monetary system, and this creates certain kind of problems that we're going to be exploring. And so then there's stuff about Nero, and we're going to think about its relation to the Jesus movement in Palestine and Roman Palestine, because there's monetary politics associated with that movement. So I made a little video about that you may have seen. We're going to look more at that. And then the third session is going to be, third seminar will be about late Rome, and in particular Constantine, who floats the gold coin against the silver coin and ushers in late antiquity in doing so. He also converts the empire to Christianity. There has to be a connection there. We're going to think about that. Okay. So what I mean by floats is that from Julius Caesar to Constantine, the Roman monetary system attempted to maintain a par value relationship between the different coins in the system. What this means is that 12, however many it is, I need to get clear about what exactly the numbers are, but 12 denarii is always going to be worth an aureus, and that might not be the right number, but it's something like that, right? So there's a fixed number of silver coins that are equivalent to one gold coin. Yeah. So there's a fixed exchange rate between the different coins in the system. Okay. Now, this creates a problem, because if the market relationship between the metals is changing, okay, why would it be changing? Well, because of a relationship to other polities, to an outside of the domestic monetary zone. Okay, India in particular, maybe Germany, other places where money might be flowing out of the empire to other places, which is something that they worry about in our sources. Okay, they interpret this through the lens of luxury. That is how it is framed ideologically. There is worry that, well, in particular, the women, and women are really important in what we read for today, so we're going to get there. Livy Book 1 is about women and the problem of women. Okay, women are wearing all these fancy clothes and these jewels. They're importing them from India, and the money is flowing out in order to buy them, and that's a problem. Okay, so we're going to both try to take that discourse seriously as like it's describing a real phenomenon, but also look underneath it as an ideology to ask how might that discourse be misunderstanding their own situation in some kind of way. Okay, but what I mean by floating the Solitus is that Constantine gave up trying to defend a fixed exchange rate between the different coins that were both legal money. Why? Well, because the silver was dropping out of circulation. Okay, silver almost completely vanishes from the Roman monetary system after the crisis of the 3rd century. So you've probably heard a kind of standard narrative, which probably comes from Gibbon, at least. I don't really want to read Gibbon, but we might have to read Gibbon, see what he says about it, which is that, the debasement of the silver money is an index of the greed or the moral decadence of the rulers, right? Rulers debase the money because they're bad rulers, because they're greedy. For instance, Nero is a prime example of a figure who has come down to us like this. One of the things that we're going to have to do as we look into this is to complicate this narrative, okay? Because one of the main reasons that you debase the silver money is because the exchange rate between two different coins, both within the domestic monetary economy, is being pressured because silver is becoming more valuable against gold. Why? Well, probably because silver was what was being exported to other places into the Indian Ocean system and as payment for imports. Okay. Now, why was silver being exported and not gold? Well, probably we'll have to look at this, but my guess would be it's because the Roman coin is overvalued. So the gold coin is overvalued. So the gold coin is worth more when it's in the empire. The silver coin is actually might be even worth more when it leaves the empire. And so it encourages importing because the Indians value the silver more highly than the Romans do in comparison to their gold. I hope you're all following me. Okay. So the one reason you might debase the coin is to keep it in circulation, because in order to maintain the exchange rate of 1 to 12 or whatever it is, you need less silver in the silver coin. Okay. So, but despite all of this, so the content of the silver coin crashes. They try to reform it in various ways in the crisis of the 3rd century. But after the 3rd century, silver money mostly vanishes from the Roman monetary system. And instead, what you have is a monetary system based on gold and bronze coins. Okay. Now, the exchange rate between gold and coins and bronze coins is very large. Okay. You need a lot of bronze to be worth the same as gold. And there's a difficulty about exchange rates between them. But the important thing is that one of these monies is the money of the poor, and the other money is the money of the rich. Okay. So we have two different monies associated with two different social classes, and the exchange rate between them is no longer fixed, but is floating in the money market. That means that it is in fact the bankers and not the state that is pricing the value of legal Roman money against gold. And what we see is the appreciation of gold against small money, which means that those who participate in the gold economy, those who have rents denominated in gold owed to them, are going to experience monetary-driven capital gains and asset inflation. Okay? Sound familiar? Sound like something we might want to think about? Yeah? Okay. So that's the trajectory that we're looking at. So we're gonna get all into the weeds of this stuff. We're gonna do research seminars where I'm gonna give you the literature that I had, but I may even have you go out and find some literature and report back on it, because I want some of, a lot of what we've done is we're looking at primary text. I give you the reading, but actually here, part of my goal for teaching the seminar is that I'm trying to learn this stuff so I can write this book about it. And I'd like the students to get a little taste of, just a little tiny taste of what it's like to live my life and wander around in the archive of this secondary literature trying to figure this stuff out, right? So so we're going to get much more into the weeds of specific questions about coins, about the metrology of coins, the measurements of them. So the money that is referenced here in Livy's book 1 is the ice grav or rudes, which are big bronze bars. There's an interesting history of these coins. I found there's a debate that's going on among the Roman historians right now, which would be illuminated by using some of my theoretical apparatus, right? So they are like everybody else. There's one side that says the money is intrinsic valued. It's the metal that really matters. And there's another side that says it's fiduciary money. It's the legal value that really matters. Well, the answer, as I argue in my work, is that it's both. And that what matters is the difference between them. Okay. So now so we're going to take a look at this literature. We'll take a look at this debate. I'm going to try to teach you some of the research tools that we need, how to understand what's at stake in measuring the archaeological artifacts that we dig up out of the ground, right? So, to get in, so with that, so that's an overview of why we're doing the Rome seminar, but we're not there yet. So to make a transition, let's go to Michel Serres. So this is one of the things that I love about what Michel, out of the many things that he says in this book that I love, Well, my favorite one is the passage where he talks about stones and buildings, and he talks about how the barbarian tears down the building to throw the stones, and the architect builds the building to immobilize the stones. I mean, that to me is just, that's incredible. I mean, every time I read that, I'm just floored. But okay. So a big part of the problem with the way that people think about monetary history is that they rely too much on literary sources. So they're only looking at one half of the spread in between the nominal and the intrinsic. Okay. What part of what I've been trying to do is to look at the intrinsic, to look at the nominal. That means studying material culture. Okay. It means taking seriously rocks in various ways. And so this is part of what Michel Serres is getting at in the section where he contrasts Greece and so there is a triangle. The triangle is Athens, Jerusalem, Rome. And the question is, where does Rome fit into this? Okay. So I'm gonna begin talking a little bit about this. I'm gonna say a little bit about Michel Serres, and then I'm gonna open up the floor, and then later on I can say what I'm saying about Livy, and because I know Jade's chomping at the bit to say something probably. So okay, so in what's at stake in the Athens, Jerusalem, Rome thing? Well, what Serres is alluding to, and he doesn't spell things out for you, but the key moment is where he says that Rome is the object, okay? And the problem is that there's a science of the object. And what does he mean by that? He means Kant, okay? He means philosophy as the science of any possible object, the science that tells us what any possible object has to be in order for it to be an object for us. Yeah? Okay. And then he says the problem that he raises at the very beginning is that history is a different kind of object. What do we have? Well, we have a complex object. We have in that lovely set piece at the very beginning where he describes the termites carrying little lumps of clay, and he describes the process through which the empire emerges as one glob among others, that then it goes critical, it experiences a phase transition, and it gobbles everything up. Okay. So we have, and it's governed by what? It's governed by what he calls the law of hatred, the law of conflict. And so what we have is the problem of a historical object, which is precisely what the science of the object, and as meant by Kant, can't think, right? It can't think history, because we are not thinking about the path dependence, the historical becoming of the objects that we're looking at. So this is the problem that history poses for us. And this is why Michel Serres says, well, I too once scorned Rome, right? Because where does the light come from? The light comes from Athens, and it comes from Jerusalem. And Jerusalem gives us the light of time, and Athens gives us the light that describes space. Okay. So what is he saying? He's saying that the axis constituted by Athens and Jerusalem is the transcendental. Okay. It is the transcendental constitution of time and space. I hope, if you don't know what I mean by that, we can try to elaborate. I hope people know what that means, right? That Kant argues about the condition of possibility of any, the condition of any possible experience. The world, in order for anything to appear to us, the world has to be given in a certain kind of way that's defined by our a priori ideas. Now, the problem is that those ideas are linear. They are Euclidean, and they are what? Well, they're the linear time of the succession of the patriarchs, the time of the king list. Okay, that's how the Hebrew Bible measures time. That might seem trivial, but it wasn't so long ago that educated people in the West tried to figure out how old the earth was by counting the years of the patriarchs. That was what you did. Okay. So there is the succession of father by son in a line that has no other dimensions to it. Okay. That defines the transcendental of our time. And there is a geometry, a Euclidean geometry, that defines the transcendental of space. Now, what Michel Serres, the point of this meditation about the black box and the cave that is Rome, is that Rome is the object. And the question is whether the object can be adequately understood by imposing upon it the transcendental. And if we think the answer is no, then we have to try to think about a way to think the object without recourse to the transcendental. Now, what's the way out? Well, it's to hear the lowing of the cattle. We have to follow the tracks of the cattle, okay? Because so there is something, there is an object that resists. But what Michel says, well, we can, if we actually just shut up for a second and listen, we might hear it, and we might be able to follow the tracks back the other way from the way that they appear to be leading. And what are we going to do by doing this? Well, we're going to discover the condition of possibility of things whose destruction was also necessary in order to make things possible. Okay? Alba is the condition of possibility of Rome, and Alba's destruction is the condition of possibility of Rome. So things only go one way. You can't unscramble the egg. Okay? We get from Alba to Rome, but we can't get from Rome to Alba. Rome destroys the possibility of Alba. But if we want to understand how things got like they are, we need to try to go back the other way, to go back the opposite way that the tracks seem to be facing. Okay, so, well, what is that? This has I'm speaking here. I'm using these extremely abstract and poetic ideas from Michel Serres, but these have completely literal consequences for the way we think about money. Okay, how does everybody else think about money? Well, money becomes what it is in history. Okay, there is a concept of money, and the history of money is the history of how money more adequately lived up to its concept. Money has always been a fiscal instrument of the state, and it just kind of accidentally had some metal in it, and then people realized they didn't need the metal, and so they made money more what it really was. Okay, so we understand money by following the tracks forward in the way that they seem to be going. Well, what I try to argue is that this would confuse us, because what we would lose is the fact that there is something whose destruction was necessary in order to make possible what there is. And the destruction of that thing has not been completely canceled or netted out in the way things are now, which is the claim that people make when they say that we don't need to understand the past because it's in the past. Okay, what are they saying? Well, they're saying that the present doesn't need to destroy the past in order to be the present. The past goes away and it just leaves. It doesn't matter anymore. What I'm trying to say is, well, it matters that the present is not the past, and there's a price that has to be paid in order to make the present not the past, in order to maintain the difference between the present and the past. Now, well, what is that price? Well, we might theorize it in a variety of different registers, but the price that is paid in Livy is what? Is the sacrifice of the Vesta, okay? Is the sacrifice of the woman, whose human sacrifice, her burial at the foundation of civilization, is its condition of possibility. Okay. So you can see why this takes us. I said at the beginning that Livy Book 1 is all about women and the problem of women, and so we're going to talk about that. But I, before I go on about it, let's hear what other people have to say. I know Jade's probably got something to say, but if you want to go before Jade, that would be fine. So everybody knows how to use the raise hand feature. Raise your hand. So we'll give it. Anybody got something they want to say about what I just said, about the reading, about anything? No. Okay, Jade, take it away.
Well, Explicitly the direction of history that all of them are addressing, like in all of the texts. And I think that Livy is really explicit in saying, I'm sure that you won't be interested in the origin of things because everything that's happening now is so fascinating. But this is what all historians are struggling with, is that the information and the narratives of the present are not sufficient to account for how things came to be and how they actually are. There's always something that's being suppressed. And in the specific story of Rome, there is the suppression of the role of women and mothers in passing power and in forming alliances that become intergenerational sources of power in regions in terms of conflict and access to resources. And you can tell that underwritten in all of these is like these are fundamental relationships that allow for powerful warlords to form. Like the precondition for a warlord forming is a mother giving birth to and provisioning them. So this is what is suppressed in Roman history and in Machiavelli's analysis of how cities form and how people come to be. Machiavelli, notorious misogynist, brilliantly hated women, probably one of the most creative forms of misogyny ever. But and you see this in the way that Serres talks about how a person who is a rapist or a murderer can become a king and a hero and the father of an entire empire. It involves the suppression of the violence and enslavement of peoples that came before, and the native, like the indigenization of people that are colonial bodies. This is another thing that's really important to look at in this Origin of Rome. There's the idea of people coming from elsewhere, people actually failing at empire elsewhere, starting up a new shop in a new town, keeping the same name, trying the same strategies, and then like working out different strategies for how to approach the suppression and enslavement of Aboriginal people using these technologies of empire. So this is also suppressed in the history of Livy. All of this is presented as extraordinarily natural. And so we are led to believe that it is natural to ignore or erase mothers and their roles in the formation of people that will come to be warlords. We also suppress the role of marriage and kinship relationships in the stabilization of regional conflicts. And then the rape of the Sabines is a really important part of the story that we're going to have to get into a little bit more clearly. But this is what's true, I think, and I really, really love the way that Serres talks about this, is that we approach history as linear. But at every other stage, history is created through a retroactive reorganization of relationships. And in the case of Hercules, the idea that a drunken thief who steals cattle can be venerated as a god and his act of vengeance is just. This is the entire legacy of Rome, is the conversion of theft to a righteous and divine act that is necessary for justice to live on the earth and for the greatest people to continue to exist as the great. This is the kernel of America. And so this is why it's so important for us to go back and look at Rome. And people will say that anything beyond 500 years is irrelevant to our conditions, but the colonial apparatus, the enslavement of people, and the collapse of kinship systems that we see in Rome is the rule book for how resource extraction continues into the present day. Yeah. And so I really appreciate the fact that they all recognize that history is nonlinear, that prophecy is retroactive, and that all of these things can change everything about what really happened. But when we go back and look in the soil and at the bones, we can see how this story benefits elites and fails to actually capture how material conditions are today. So I really, really like that that kernel is in all of the texts.
It's everywhere. Good. Okay, great. So we got some hands now. So one more thought, and then I'll go to the hands, which is, so thinking about, okay, so, what's the alternative to linear history? Well, here we're going to have to, here is where I want to call attention to Serres' claim, this wonderful claim he makes where he says economy and theology are equivalent interpretations of history, and that history doesn't explain myth, myth explains history. Okay, so one of the things we're going to have to think about is how seriously can we take this claim that myth explains history? I'm going to try to make the case that we can take them very seriously. And here I just want to call attention to those who may not have noticed, who haven't been primed for these things to jump out at you like a blinking beacon. Okay, what do we have in Livy? We have many of exactly the same myths that we've been looking elsewhere. Okay, Livy's myths, and as we're going to find when we go to the next seminar where we look at some of the historical material, most of what Livy is writing here is almost entirely fictional. Not just book one, but also the next book that we're going to read for next time about the early Republic. None of that happened, at least not in anything like the way that it's said in Livy. And it gets really into the weeds to get into some of the stuff, so we're gonna do it in the next seminar, but I'll hint at it a little bit next time. Okay, so a lot of what Livy is writing is basically fiction. It's mythology, and our question is, how can we read this mythology symptomatically in order to learn something about history? And I think one of the things that underwrites the idea that there might be something to learn about history from the myths is that we see these same story patterns everywhere. Okay, so we have in Livy, we have the Moses myth. Okay, we have the abandonment of the child into the river, which is a failed exposure that leads the child to a family who raises him. It's the Moses myth, and it's also the Oedipus myth. Okay, they're the same myth. Now, we also have also the Superman myth. Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. That's right. So we also have Evander. Okay, who Michel Serres gets a lot of mileage out of the opposition between Evander, i.e., good man, and Cacus, i.e., baddie. Right. And well, Evander he brings the alphabet. That's important because here he's the analog of Cadmus. Okay, so Cadmus is the ancestor of Oedipus. He is a Phoenician who brings the alphabet. Here we have a Greek who brings the alphabet. So what do we have? Well, we have Phoenicians pushing westward and Greeks pushing westward under the pressure of the Phoenicians pushing westward. Okay, so we have a westward movement away from the core areas of the Bronze Age, which is Egypt and Mesopotamia, and they're carrying with them various things, one of which is language, but there's other things as well. Okay, so we have the Moses myth, we have the Oedipus myth in the myth of Romulus. We have Evander as a parallel for Cadmus. There's other things that we could go through, and so I want you to notice. Okay, where do we see these things popping up? Okay, so more to talk about, but let's hear what other people have to say. So we got Thatcher, Alex, and then Brooke. Thatcher.
I think Jade's explanation may have answered my question, but maybe can we talk a little bit about what Serres refers to as prescription? Is that the process by which we sort of retroactively naturalize the decision of, or the direction of history? It's like, okay, well, is this person a robber or a victim? Because he was referring to that a lot, and I didn't really know what he meant in that specific.
He calls it prescription or proscription.
Prescription. Prescription. He talks a little bit about inscription, but prescription. It seems to me like sort of riffing off of what Jade was describing as this process of naturalizing, basically the power naturalizing and creating the story that happened in the past. I wonder if either of y'all had any insight into that, because that when I read that I couldn't understand specifically how he was using that word, and it seemed important in this sort of how you go from this unclear direction to history.
Yeah, good. So I found the passage, but I think it seems like Dave might have something to add here.
So this may be because I'm a lawyer, but it struck me as being used in the legalistic sense of, prescription. You kind of see it in things like, if you're talking about like criminal liability, like statutes of limitation, right? After a certain time period passes, you just ignore the wrong that's been done, right? And likewise, if you're talking about property that's been occupied by someone else, prescription is the period after which it becomes someone else's property, or adverse possession, it's often called. So that's how it struck me. I think he's using it in more than one sense there, but I think he was talking about the historic crimes that we've just discussed.
Yeah.
Also moral prescriptivism, which is something that a lot of the French philosophers were discussing at the time, that there are moral imperatives, and history is in this way justifying these imperial imperatives by naturalizing them as well.
Yeah. So yeah, great. That's really helpful. So yeah, so just to kind of read from the passage a little bit, he says, ever since Remus, Cacus, Curiatus, and Camilla have rested in peace, there has been prescription. Justice is founded on it. If prescription never existed, vengeance would rage inextinguishably, and the blind and sticky emotion would return. The philosophy of history must be founded on prescription. Okay, so we have on the one hand a maybe more philosophical question. Of course, we've been reading Derrida also, and so there's a lot in here that connects to the Derrida. We're reading that for a reason. So there's the question of writing in general, and it's what, but even before we get to that, I wanna offer a few thoughts about this prescription issue. So you know what, this is the problem of foundational violence of the political order, right? And there is, so we will probably, when we do Greek history at some point, we're going to read this book that has been really important to my thinking by James McGlew called Tyranny and Political Culture in Ancient Greece. And a lot of what he talks about is the ambiguous relationship between founders and tyrants, right? The founder of the political order is somebody who is only not a tyrant because retroactively they turn out to have been good. Okay. And so all, you know, there is a problem, and this is also the problem of Carl Schmitt and the Nomos of the Earth, is the fundamentally arbitrary and ungrounded nature of the spatial distribution of wealth and power in the political system. That's what nomos means. Okay, nomos really means, I think the best way to translate it is the law of distribution. That's the basic sense of the Greek word. If we get Martin here next time, he can either correct me or elaborate on the etymology stuff. But it is the law of distribution, which is different than the written law, the logos. All right, that is the positive law rather than divine law. The nomos has an idea of being divine. So there's a problem of, well, all political order depends upon making an arbitrary incision into history that says what matters and what doesn't anymore. We have this problem. Why? Because of slavery and genocide that founds the modern order. Okay, our nomos of the earth is founded in the Atlantic chattel slavery, in the genocide of the Americas. The question for us is, can we continue to suppress the violence, or do we need to dig it up and deal with it in order to get what we want, right? I mean, do we have to deal with that, or can we let it continue, or can we continue to insist that the statute of limitations has passed and we don't have to deal with it anymore? Okay, this is the deep issue about reparations that I think is overlooked in certain arguments that may have been made recently by certain people about how reparations should be forward-looking in its justificatory grounds. Okay, the idea that we don't, that it's you know, we can justify reparations without having to think about it as a fundamental challenge to the legitimacy of the political order. Okay, so we have this problem, I think, for what should be obvious reasons. You know, there's not only early modern political violence, but also the political violence of World War II and what is called decolonization, right? So you know, some people maintain that, you know, we don't have empire anymore because there was decolonization. Well, what do we have? We have a political order, an interstate system that was created by decolonization and that was imposed by the empire in the process of decolonizing itself. That's a certain kind of problem, and that's where that's the foundation of our monetary system that we have, right? Our international monetary system was born in the 20th century, in after World War II. Okay, so we have that problem. This problem is also related to the problem of sovereignty as such. And I write about this in my dissertation in chapter 2 when I look at the debates around the succession of James Stewart. So one of the major questions, and in fact, this is like the question, and depending on how you answered it, all kinds of other things would follow, like including like, who should the King of England be? Okay, so we have an abstract question that has real consequences for who's the sovereign. And this question was, does time run against the king? Okay, so the question there is sovereignty subject to the statute of limitations or not? Okay, so the problem is that if you maintain that time runneth not against the king, this was actually in a way it constrains the power of the sovereign. So one of the what do you call them, landmark legal cases or whatever, concerns a lease on the Duchy of Lancaster. So Elizabeth owned these lands in the Duchy of Lancaster, but they had been leased by her predecessor, by Mary, or it might have been Edward. They'd been leased, and the question was, upon the new king, is the lease still valid or not? And the answer was no. Why? Well, because time runneth not against the king. What part of what this meant was that even though, it must have been Edward, even though Edward was a minor when he leased the lands, which would have created certain potentials for the lease to be revoked, even though he was a minor, he did it as the king, and so therefore, it couldn't be defeated by time, right? So the question of whether or not the king can be defeated by time is a question that has implications for the status of contracts of sovereign debt, for instance, across the succession of rulers. Yeah. Okay. So these questions are all very important, and they're relevant in other periods that we have. So I hope that clears up a little bit what's meant by prescription. I mean, I think then we would want to ask about writing and everything. I don't have a thought on that at the moment, but maybe we should. It's there, and Michelle Serra can't write a word that has script in it and not be thinking about writing. It's right there. Okay. So Alex and then Brooke.
Yeah, so I was just kind of struck by like something that was drawn attention to in the notes of Livy, which is like Livy's sort of systematic skepticism about like some of these divinity claims. And also it seems like he's making allusions with when he's talking about, in particular, the divinization of kings and these sort of like founding myths to Julius and Octavius. I don't know much about like the history of like what was going on at the time with Julius and Octavius and what in particular he's responding to. It seems like there's something about even like the way that he talks about these guys who he knows, like, I have to say good things about Romulus, but then he describes him and he sounds like, this seems like a kind of shitty guy. All right, I guess I'll say he's divine. People say he's divine, so that's sort of like something that I like was interested in as it came up in the text.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is the question of what is at stake in the relationship between the ruler and the gods. Well, we're going to have to think about augury, which is one of the major things that happens in Livy. But it's also, I mean, it's there in, I mean, that's the whole point of the Jesus myth, is about the relationship, to what extent is God a king? Is if God is a king, then he is a self-sacrificing king, and what exactly does that mean? Okay, there's a problem when we look. Well, at some point we'll do something about Alexander, right? That's the problem with Alexander, is that he started making people walk on purple carpets towards him, and he started acting like an Eastern king. So there's a fundamental Orientophobia that structures Western political thinking. One of the things that I like to harp on is that this matters because of the relationship to debt. Okay, because the Eastern king can cancel the debt, can declare the Jubilee, which is what Christ was doing. Okay, so there is a problem about, well, when the king makes claims to divinity, he's situating himself in a relationship to the law by which we should primarily understand the law of contracts. And he's making a claim about the authority of sovereign power to intervene into contracts. Right? Now, what's one of the ways that sovereign authority might intervene in the contracts? Well, by altering the money that is the object of the contract. Okay, so you can see these. So the debate about whether or not the king is a god is exactly the same thing as the debate about MMT and about chartalism that we're having today. Is about what is the relationship between sovereign authority, executive power, and the law that says that the treasury must balance its books. Okay, MMT says the sovereign's above the law. The sovereign, so you look in their literature and you'll see lots of talk about self-imposed constraints. There's the idea that self-imposed constraints are absurd. How could God limit himself? That's absurd. Well, if we say the king's not a god, and in fact, it's really, really important that the king is not a god, one of the things that we're saying is that it's not absurd for the sovereign to limit itself, because what's really happening is that God is limiting the sovereign. Okay, so this leads us to the political theological problem as it is expressed in Plato's Statesman, which is about, first of all, so Machiavelli references this. So just to throw, we're probably going to talk at least about Machiavelli out of all the texts we're reading it, because it's partly there. But as Jake kind of alluded to, he's going the wrong direction. So Machiavelli is kind of a negative example. So we're gonna talk about what he's doing, but he's repressing all the interesting problems, which is interesting in its own right. But so Machiavelli alludes to this, right? This is where we have the first of all the tripartite schema, which is rule in the hands of one, a few, or many. That's the kind of tradition. That's the basic division. But then we cut it across with another axis, which is, and is sovereignty above or below the law, right? So you could have a king who's below the law, or you could have a tyrant who's above the law. You could have an aristocracy who are below the law, or an oligarchy who are above the law, or you could have the democracy that's below the law, or you could have the mob that is above the law. Okay, and that's the problem. And what this is a discourse about political risk and upside and downside risk and hedging, right? Because part of the point that's being made here is that some regimes give you better stuff when they're working, but when they're not working, they're worse. And the question is what level of risk is worth what kind of results? That's the political question about the Constitution. Okay. I think that's everything I wanted to say. Brooke, what's on your mind?
Yeah, I was just thinking about what you're talking about of like book one of Livy really being like about the problem of women, which is not what I would have thought originally after reading it, because they appear so infrequently. But in my notes, I did have some cases where they appear like in a strange way, like the story about like, is it the Sabine woman that they originally kidnapped at the beginning?
The Sabines, yeah, the
Sabines. Okay, Sabine, yeah, like. Yeah, the kidnap and the rape of the Sabine, Sabine women, and then they basically disappear after that. Like Rome just needs them as a resource, and then they disappear. And I was like, I expect this from like someone writing at this time period. But then they come back suddenly in the war, where like the two sides are fighting, and then all the women just show up in the middle, and they're like, "Hey guys, fighting is bad. Like some of you are husbands now, and some of you are fathers. Let's all get along." And everyone just listens to them. And I was both confused, like, why is everyone listening to these people who, by the way the story's been told so far, are just a resource that's being like fought over and needed to like pump children out to make your city? And why are they like so invested in both sides when they were like kidnapped and raped? It's just kind of odd that they show up like that. And then
it's because they have children. It's right. Because they have children, and no one in Roman history considers children people. And so they are entirely absent from all narratives. So that's the important part that's missing from that, is they had stayed long enough that they now had stake in the futurity of Rome because their children were Roman.
That makes sense. And then, yeah.
Okay, you go ahead. Okay.
No, you can keep going. I had a different point of just something else I was thinking about, but you can go. on that.
Well, it's just specifically about the stealing of women. So we need to look at the fact that the entire origin of this family line is Troy, where a woman was stolen and a war was fought, and then they were forced to flee. So these are people that come from an imperial legacy out of Greece, in which the stealing of women is an establishment of a territorial claim. It is how you are asserting your intention to dominate a territory, because you are usurping the actual line of inheritance from those places. And so in this story also, what we have is a gang of men who have been pushed out by war coming into a new territory. And the leader is like, okay, so like, why are you here? What's going on? In one version of the myth, there's actually a conflict, but the one that's probably more likely is in which it's like, so you're a roving gang of able-bodied warriors, and I have my own beef with this guy that I've had to promise my daughter to in order to establish an alliance. I would much rather give my daughter to you and then use you as a military force to dominate my neighbors. So this is the narrative of intra-elite conflict, using roving bands of people, mercenaries essentially, to help establish and increase their relative position in their local communities. The problem is this introduces variables that actually destabilize those power formations and causes cascading problems, which we see in this entire narrative. This is what's happening from generation to generation, is there isn't a consolidation of the territorial claim, and there's this constant need to steal more women or to form forced military alliances around marriage with women in order to actually complete this conquest. The rape of the Sabine, they literally need women in order to form alliances with the communities around them. So what's being rejected is not like, they're not asking for wives because they want somebody to cook for them and be lonely. They're asking for wives because they want a military alliance, and they're rejected. So they're like, well, if you're going to reject us, we're going to make it impossible for you to form alliances with others. That's what's missing from all of this as well, is that women are not just women as like reproductive agents or as domestic labor. Women are the site of alliance between communities, and it is the circulation of women and the circulation of men that determines all territorial borders. So that's what is missing from all this. So you go back onto the other stuff. I just had to yell that really
loud. No, that's very helpful. Yeah.
Brooke, before you go on, I want to add some more stuff on the tails. So this is really exciting stuff. I hope I kind of, partly with Jade's help and partly through asking my own, like this. So here we're into this problem of matrilineality and matrolocality, and these are problems that are repressed in the history that we have, but we can decode it. Okay, I discovered this problem when I was trying to figure out why the Oedipus, the Theban cycle, why the kings succeeded one another. So this jumped out to me like a sore thumb when I was reading Livy. I bet probably unless you've read my work on it, you might not have noticed. Okay, but did people notice? Okay, so we have in book one, we have a series of succession. We have a series of kings. The history takes us roughly, okay, let's locate where we are in history. The history takes us roughly from the middle of the 8th century. This 753 is the traditional date for the founding of Rome, okay? And it takes us up to the beginning of the 5th century. So the deposition of Tarquin Superbus probably happens around 495. I think this is just what Wikipedia says. So, and we might look at the literature about it. Okay, so we're looking about from the 8th century to the 5th century. I want to locate this a little bit in a broader context. So in the 8th century, we are looking at this is happening in a broader Mediterranean context. Okay, and so in the 8th century, there is a breakup of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. They're invaded by the Medes, and this is the context, kind of that. Well, later on in the fighting over the what is left of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, we eventually get the first coins that are minted. But really, part of what's happening is a general breakup of a kind of club of powers, of which in the West, the Phoenicians are really important. Okay, so that's why I emphasized Evander and the alphabet and made the connection to Cadmus, the Phoenician, who introduces the alphabet to Greece. Okay, which is that there is a aristocratic Phoenician world that ties together different places in the Mediterranean through these bonds of aristocratic kinship. And we see these, so like Cadmus leaves Thebes and he goes someplace else. They're floating around. During this kind of 8th and 7th century breakup of the integration of the world system, we see territorial powers and territorial identities asserting themselves against this kind of Phoenician intra-Mediterranean kinship system. So I have some literature on this that we'll read when we get into the weeds about it in the next seminar. So now, and then where we end up is with the fall of the Tarquins, and this is happening at about the same time, a little bit later, but about the same time as the overthrow of the Pisistratids in Athens. And the stories are in many ways very similar, okay? Both of these are tyrannical rulers who are doing what? They're presiding over the expansion of fiscal systems, okay? So notice the complaints in Livy about how the Roman plebs have been reduced to wage workers when they used to be warriors, right? Because now they're being paid to do what? Well, to build the sewer, one thing, to build the walls, to build the arenas, right? Which are institutions of public legitimacy in the same way that football stadiums are, right? Why do we build football stadiums with public funds? Because they legitimize regional identities. Same thing with the circus. So there, yeah, monumental architecture, right? So creation of monumental architecture involves the expansion of the fiscal system. We see this in the Pisistratids and in the Tarquins, and they also commit crimes against women. They are incestuous and they're rapists in various different kinds of ways, and then they're overthrown by the tyrannicide, by Brutus, or by the Athenian tyrannicides whose names escape me at the moment. And so this is happening kind of at the turn of the 5th century, which is, well, that's in the beginnings of the Persian War, right? So it's around this time that, well, there's the rise of the Persian Empire. They're the major monetary power of the period, and they're invading Greece. So now the Aegean, we're on the other side of the Aegean, so we're farther away, but we're part of what was called Magna Graeca, okay? Greater Greece. That's why we have these people with Greek names who are showing up, because they're colonists, okay? So my point is that these events, there's similar events happening around the same time at similar places. And so what we can see is an ebb and flow of the integration and centralization of the world system, right? The beginning of this cycle is the Bronze Age collapse, right? In the 12th century, which is the origin of kind of Phoenician power and all of that, right? So that's why there's the Greek Dark Age. That's the Homeric period. The Trojan War story might kind of be about that. It's one kind of possibility for what it is that we're talking about here. Okay, so the reason I got started talking about, yeah.
A power vacuum that is created by elites moving out of the territorial arenas that they had been managing before. Like that's kind of like the important thing, is there was this ruling body that removed itself in order to avoid the conflict that was coming from the collapse of their extraction. Yeah. And so like they parachuted out.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So the point that the reason I'm bringing this up is that, well, so we have this history that begins in the 8th century, and there's a succession of kings. Did anybody notice what the pattern is for who succeeds whom? It's always the same. So in the history that we get from Livy, how does he kind of present it? Well, it's kind of arbitrary, it almost seems like. Everybody is kind of just fighting, and there's not really any rule for who's succeeding the king, right? And we even get kind of the idea that the rightful ruler should have been the son of the king, but it didn't go that way for various reasons. Okay, that's kind of the picture we get. But if you just pay attention, you read it and you say, okay, who succeeds who and what is their kinship relation? It is exactly the same every time, which is that the one who succeeds the king is his son-in-law. Every single time, the new king is the husband of the daughter of the old king. Every single time, right? No exceptions. I looked. Okay, that's the pattern. So these Bronze Age, I mean, regular Iron Age, I guess, but they come from the Bronze Age, right? So we assume. Oh, and you'll also see this pattern in the Julio-Claudian emperors too. They do the same thing. So there is we assume that patrilineality is how sovereignty works. That's what we think, because that's later European process. But that's not how it worked in this society, right? So instead, the king chooses his successor in consultation with the other big men by marrying his daughter to the person who's going to be the new king, right? So this is what sets off the conflict between Turnus and Aeneas, which is that Turnus was supposed to marry the king, the daughter of whatever that guy's name is, the original king. Anybody know which one I'm talking about? The king of the Latins.
The Alba-Longan guy, right?
Before that. This is before.
Oh yeah, no, you're right. Yeah,
it's the father of Lavinia. Anyway,
Meninus or something like that. Anyway,
I'm not sure. Anyway, he's the original king of the Latins. So he was supposed to marry his daughter to Turnus, and he says, no, I'm marrying him to Aeneas instead. That means that Aeneas is going to succeed him as the king. Now, what's the reason for that? Latinus, yeah, that's his name. So what's Well, anybody who doesn't already know the answer want to speculate? What's the purpose of this social convention? Like, what's the reason that you would want to have matrilineal succession of kingship? What does that do? Just jump in if you have a theory.
I guess maybe it prevents like one family from having all the power, just like you do in regular like lineage, dynastic lineage.
Yeah, exactly. You should say that more confidently because you're exactly right. Yeah. So not everything is matrilineal. Okay. The ancestral lands are patrilineal. Okay. There are clans, and these clans are patrilineal. Now, so if you have your ancestral lands that you've got your ancestor cult and everything, that goes from father to son, but the kingship doesn't. The kingship is different from the other kinds of inheritance. The kingship is not just property the same way other property is. What does this accomplish? Well, it ensures that the kingship is going to rotate between the different patrilineal clans, because the same clan can never hold it twice in a row. Okay, so we can make a little gesture at Machiavelli. Remember when Machiavelli is concerned? He reads this succession. He says, if you have two strong rulers in a row, then you can have the whole world or whatever, right? He's interested in this question of the orderly succession of the kings, right? So, but the whole point of the matrilineal kingship succession is that it rotates the sovereignty among these different clans. And what these tyrannical rulers try to do, the Tarquins or the Pisistratids, is they try to monopolize the sovereignty into a single patrilineal clan. And that's a problem because it means that the other clans get shut out. And all of a sudden it creates a conflict of interest between the ruling clan and the others, right? So on the one hand, we have the problem of matrilineality, which is clearly the pattern that it happens, right? So what clicked for me, I just love this, right? Our sources don't really understand that this is how things used to be. They misunderstand their own history. They think that the patriline is the rule and then it's being broken, but it's preserved for us in the list of names. All we need to know is the list of names, because no matter how much they try to read the patriline into the history, they still have to have the kings in the same order. and they know who they're married to. And so the pattern is right there. All we have to do is just keep track of who's related to who, how, and what order they succeed one another in. And we see that it's clearly matrilineal. So again, I mean, I hope, so to return back to what I said at the beginning, if we listen, we can hear the cattle, right? I mean, it's there. It's the history that we have, no matter how fantastical or fictional it is, preserves little clues that if we know how to listen for them and know how to read them, we can allow myth to explain history for us. Okay, so there's one problem of the matrilineal or matrilineal stuff. Then there's another problem of matrilocality, which I suspect is partly what the Sabine story is about. But I've now been talking for a long time. So, and Brooke has had his hand up for a little bit. So let's hear from Brooke and then Jade, and then we'll see if we can get to the Sabines.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of like, now I kind of put out that thing about the women and then all that information for you guys. Like, so I guess that's kind of like, for me, trying to understand what Ceres is getting at about like what you're talking about of what needs to be like repressed in order for like the order that we see to exist and erased. Part of that is the role of women in this alliance system, because I guess in the period that Livy is writing in, that alliance, like their importance has been already repressed, like in terms of their importance in alliances we're talking about, maybe if I'm understanding correctly. So he what he's doing in this history telling, which I guess is what Ceres was talking about. For one thing I did get out of them was, because I think Ceres brings up like, is myth, because one way of thinking about myth is it's just like the broken telephone, like something actually happened and then a bunch of people just kind of mangled it as they passed it from one to the other, and like we're just seeing the real past, but you know, sort of distorted by repeated retelling. But what he's presenting is actually it's a rewriting of the past to put the present into the past and justify it. And I think he used the word blueprint maybe once or twice, which I thought was interesting, because that is what Machiavelli basically does with this book. He basically says, oh, thanks, Livy, for the blueprint on how to make the perfect republic. And then he like tries to systematize it into a manual to give to rulers.
Yeah. Well, what's Dave?
Oh, I was just going to say, I mean, I think Machiavelli is doing that, but he's also very much got his own agenda too. And so he's happy enough to shift things and, you know, either not care about getting stuff wrong, even in the text, as you can see from some of the footnotes, or, you know, I think he's doing a blueprint, but he's also, I mean, it's not really a discourse on Livy, right? It's a book on, it's his book on republicanism, right? Using Livy as sort of an inspiration, but I mean, you can see it jumps all over the place. Yeah. So sorry, I didn't want to take us too far.
No, inspiration,
but he's got his own agenda.
Inspiration and justification, I think.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, part of the point that I want to make is that's Livy too. Livy's also doing that, right? I mean, that's true. That's what Livy's doing. So it's there all the way down.
Right.
And one thing that I think is interesting is, so Machiavelli picks up on one strand of something that's happening in Livy, which is the nostalgia thing, right? Which is that we need to understand ourselves as degenerates. And we have so there's a theory of virtue and degeneracy that's in Livy. He says that. But what I think is interesting, and this is one of the themes that Jade and I are harping on, is that there is no original unity. It's not that we've fallen from a world in which there was kinship and no antagonism, right? Or in which there was, you know, people knew how to be virtuous and now we've forgotten. It's that antagonism and violence were always there in the kinship structures. And that's what we're seeing in Livy, okay? In this first book of Livy, which is that there is, whether or not Livy fully understands even what it is that he's writing about, when he goes to find the origin of the problem, well, he finds that the problem has always already been there, which is part of Michel Serres' point, right? When he says that there's bodies under bodies under bodies. So we go back and we find that the problems are already there. Okay, so one of the things that we're going to be developing as we move forward through this seminar, through this sequence, as we read more Livy, we're going to find the social war, which is the problem of debt. All right, that's the economy problem, which is the problem about money and debt. And what we're trying to think about is how that's related to the kinship problem. Because, well, one of the things that we'll have to tease out is what's at stake in the difference between plebeians and plebs, and what is the real history of this distinction that is lurking underneath the history that Livy is telling. Just to give you a little bit of a hint of what I am alluding to there, it seems likely that the distinction between pleb and patrician didn't exist yet in the time that much of what Livy is writing about. Okay, it's a later development that he's reading backwards into the history. So at some point, it may have been in the early 4th century, there was a counter-revolution in Rome of some kind that probably established the institution of the consuls and limited the access to these magistracies to the ruling part of the gens. Okay, so the gens is this set of people who all share the same names. What's curious about it is that there are patrician and plebeian branches of the gens. All right, it's not that there's one gens that's a patrician gens and another gens that's a plebeian gens. No, it's that there are plebeian and patrician people with the same name who are part of the same gens, but they're distinguished in this way. So there seems to have been some reform in which a distinction between patrician and pleb branches of the same gens was instituted in order to restrict access to magistracies. And we'll be looking at some of that. Now, what's interesting is that and so part of the way that they do this is they have to police these boundaries by passing laws against intermarriage. Because the problem is that when you make distinctions between noble and base lineages, they tend to fuck each other and they fuck it up, right? They fuck up the difference between these things, literally and figuratively, and you have to keep them separate. Now, okay, this matters to also, this problem is relevant to more recent things, such as the one-drop rule in the Americas, which is that we have a distinction between white and black, and when you fuck it up, we need a way to keep it from getting fucked up, and we call that the one-drop rule, or the law of wombs, and all that kind of stuff, right? So, and this matters because one of the things that we're going to have to look at when we take Roman history seriously is the relationship between slave and free, which is something we're going to be obviously talking a lot more about, and the porosity of the boundary between those things, because in Rome, they're rather more porous than they are in the Atlantic system. Okay, but we see, my point is that we see this problem already in Livy's imaginary history of the very beginning of Rome, because what's the thing that they do after the rape of the Sabines? They pass a law against intermarriage with the other Latins. So I read this story and I wonder, what actually was the crime? Was the crime taking the women? Or was the crime refusing to give them back? Do you see? The way the story is presented to us, they seize the women, and then later on they pass this law against intermarriage, and there's not like a lot of comment or drama around it. But what if the seizure of the women was really just taking the women in the way that you were supposed to, but then severing the reciprocal movement of women to the other tribes, right? And after which the integrating of foreign women into the community would retroactively be seen as rape. Rape, and not in our sense, but in the sense of the stealing of the woman, right? Okay, Jade, what do you think?
So I think that the role of breaking up of circulation and kinship systems, like this is specifically what needs to be addressed around, like from Agamemnon, like walking across the purple carpets until now. And one of the things that is also a functional outcome of having inheritance carried through a daughter is that a father is not competing with his son for inheritance. So it actually decreases intergenerational conflict and displaces that conflict to outside groups. So it actually creates in-group solidarity. And And the reason that incest is viewed as a crime is because it closes off those options for other communities. What the agenda of Roman colonialism that makes it distinct from the way that other people in that area did war is that they refused to follow the protocols around hospitality and women and those sorts of things. They fundamentally violated what was considered the norm of kinship. And they would use ships later on in different periods, go and steal all of the women from communities, thus rendering that community dead within a single generation. This strategy fundamentally destabilizes culture transmission, and it creates extremely good warriors, because what you're doing is taking women away. These are women of lower status. And then the children can be taken away from those women and then raised to be soldiers. So it actually is like a really great program for advancing the imperial project. It became refined in Greece in many ways before, but then with Rome, it became kind of like scientifically instituted. The actual protocol was like more robust than it had ever been in any other context, and has continuity through the transatlantic slave trade. I think what we see is like the increasing mechanization and positivism applied to this project of how to produce the most people to be squandered. Rome is really the origin of this, because you're seeing Rome as the composite site of a lot of imperial strategies coming together. Mesopotamian, Greek, there's a lot of things happening there, but all of them are technologies specifically around how to utilize women as the producers of labor, but then also as the producers of claims. And this is why I think it's really interesting to talk about Caesar. Caesar and the Julii claim ancestry to Venus. They specifically do this through the establishment of Rome, through Romulus and Remus and their connection to the Trojans. So like there is this necessary retroactive mythological claim that happens through women. It is through women that claims to power and divinity are cultivated, but that requires those women being separated from their source communities and basically having their foreignness utilized against them so that they cannot make claims within the community, but are used to leverage claims against others. So like this, I think that's something that's really necessary as we go through the rest of Roman history. And especially when we get to like the period of Julius Caesar in particular, this is a strategy that has become so refined from the founding of Rome to that period that they don't talk about it in the historical text. It is so assumed that it is left out. Like this is the absence of it is important because it's something that modern historians can't reconstruct, that the entire strategy of these communities was the seizure and removal of women from others. Like that I think that's necessary to consider, and what technologies they used in order to accomplish that. Specifically, like strategies around warfare and fortifications, but then the use of ships. Like those are big deals that we're going to have to like really zero in on as we go.
Yeah. I mean, so of course, so the other thing here is when we're thinking about labor, soldiers, and claims, now we need to think about the distinction between free and slave. Okay. Notice Machiavelli doesn't say anything about slavery in the entire, that drops out completely. Okay. All we have is the patricians and the plebs. Well, already in Livy, we have the problem whose name is Servius Tullius. Okay. We have the problem of the slave who becomes a king. Why? Well, because he's selected by the previous king to marry his daughter. And in so doing, he pisses off the clan of the previous king, who expected the sons of the previous king who wanted to marry his daughter so that he could be king. Okay. So well, what do we have? I mean, we have a sovereignty that is being transmitted on the grounds of perceptions of merit, of bureaucratic merit, as opposed to lineage. Okay. That's a problem. What does Servius Tullius do? He institutes the census, which is a horrible crime because we're counting how much money everybody has so that we can take more money from rich people. Okay, that's at least, well, is that really what the census is for? Maybe, but at least that's one reason that that's what is told in the text, right? So we have the division of the army according to the division of wealth. This introduces a problem that is going to be relevant to us as we move forward, which is the question of the valuation of land in money terms. Yeah, because if you noticed, right, their wealth is being counted in what? In asses, which is this bronze money that I was telling you about that we're going to look at. A little later, as you read Livy, there's going to be a moment when Livy talks about certain fines that are being paid, and he's astounded because the fines are hundreds of thousands of asses, which is like a big bronze thing. And Livy's like, you know what, did they like have huge carts full of asses to pay the fines or whatever? Well, clearly what we're looking at here is a credit money system. Okay, there's so we see things, we see wealth being valued in terms of money, which what? It creates a lot more nominal money than there is real money. That's the problem of banking. Okay, that creates the possibility of credit crises, as we're going to look at when we look at the Jesus movement stuff, because there was a credit crisis in Rome in 33 BC, which is the same year that Jesus was crucified. Maybe that can't be a coincidence, right? Okay, so we have the valuation of assets in nominal money, and now there's a problem about what's the relationship between nominal money and cash and specie. Okay, so in the same way that later on in the 2nd century, we're going to see the silver content of the denarius crash into the floor until it ceases to exist as a real coin, we're also going to see the ass decline in its value. And so one of the major questions that I want us to be thinking about is, what are the political and social consequences of changes in the real value of the unit of account as expressed in metal terms? Okay, because the traditional story about it, debasement bad, king greedy. Okay, that is the story as told from the point of view of the aristocracy. Why bad? King bad, debased coin. Well, because you're owed rents in money. And if the king debases the money, then you get less metal when the peasants pay your rent. So you don't like that. Okay, but there may be other constituencies that do. Okay, so this is going to be related for reasons that I'm just going to put them on the table and you can ponder it. And maybe over the next 3 years, you'll understand exactly what I mean by this. But that matters for understanding the relationship between free and slave. Because what we have, and I'll finish up in just a second and somebody else can talk. What we have is not a 2-part class relationship. Okay, we do not have a relationship between patricians and plebs, which is the 2-part model that we get from Marx, which is that there's capitalists and workers, and that's what society is. No. We have masters and we have slaves, and somewhere in the middle, we have the plebs. And the plebs live in a constant state of anxiety about which side of the line they're really on. And this is a problem because when they fall into debt and they can't pay it, what happens? You become a slave. You become bound. You are put into bondage, literally. Okay. So we have the problem of how the indecision, the ambiguity about the status of the plebs can be dynamically hedged across generational time, in which the endogenous instabilities of kinship structures threaten to fuck up the difference. Do you see? Okay, so we want to be thinking about monetary politics in relationship to the debt problem, which is a problem about the valuation of land in money terms. Okay, but what we see here in Livy is that there is a kernel that is before all of that, and that is the kernel of kinship. Okay, Jade.
Well, and just very specifically that what tyrants end up doing is making a lot of new men, actually flooding money into arenas of potential kinship. Basically, they allow men that otherwise, because of the hoarding of elites, would be restricted from being able to accumulate the startup funds to get married and make families. That tyrants actually facilitate men that would otherwise be excluded from kinship into entering it. And so the incentive for these people that are functioning as mercenaries for these tyrants, we can say that they want the money, but why do people want money? It's to live. And what is the promise that Rome gives to all of its veterans as it develops? It's that you too can own land, establish a household, have a wife, become a patriarch, and rule over your children and your slaves. And Livy even says the most important property, children. Like I thought that was really wonderfully inserted in there too. Like what is not emphasized, but is really important to understand in all of these financial dynamics is that they are directly impacting people's ability to reproduce and to function within society. And that when we see these historical events in which leaders are described as monstrous, they are fundamentally violating the social order by conducting incest, by breaking the laws around how you treat kin, killing brothers, killing fathers, that sort of thing. But they're also opening up to men of lower status the opportunity to have women and money as spoils of war so that they can enter into arenas of kinship that they might otherwise have been restricted. So that's another thing to consider. Like, who are these youths, these Roman youths,
right,
these young men that are facilitating these military expansions? They are men that want to leapfrog over inheritance and alliance and destiny as it's been previously like established in these kinship systems. They want it now, and they want it on their terms, and they will take it from every other established order. And this is kind of the threat of the aristocracy, is the idea that you can be raided by barbarians, by bands of landless, cultureless people who will take everything you have, including your legacy. They'll take your family, they'll take your daughters. And that's where a lot of the class tension around old wealth and new wealth exists as well, is that like the new wealth is a direct threat to these like established hoarding patterns that they have.
Yeah. Okay. So point of order, I forget whether I said 90 minutes or 2 hours for this. Did I say, Patrick, you got to go?
At some point soon. I'm
okay,
cool. Happy to hang out longer. I'm just
well, let's
thinking about my next few hours.
Great, wonderful. Yeah, so I think I probably said 90 minutes. That was dumb. I should have said 2 hours. So well let's start wrapping up. So we'll avoid. We've given you plenty to kind of ponder today as you read for next time. So but Brooke, you can go ahead and put your thought in there.
Okay, maybe it's good. It's a good wrapping up point, because this is just a point of curiosity for me going forward in these lectures or seminars. And like, I guess one thing that a lot of people have said to me that I've always been skeptical about in terms of like the conventional narrative is like, I've heard a lot of people say things like, oh, the Roman Empire collapsed because they didn't understand economics. And they didn't know what inflation was. They basically didn't have like the wealth of nations or something to do stuff. And if only they had that, then things might have been different. And that is just like, given like everything I've seen from like your work, it seems like people did understand quite a bit about how their economic systems were working. Yes. And probably more likely there's something else was going on. So that was just a point of curiosity for me. And just a quick point on what Jade said. I did notice in terms of new men and the making of new men by tyrants, like that is something that Machiavelli kind of touches on. At least there's one part where he kind of thinks that like, the prince should do that sort of strategically to keep, otherwise the plebs get really mad. So you should be like kind of giving them a little bit of stuff, but not too much, because then you make the rich people mad. So it's this giant balancing act. Yeah,
that's great. So I think we'll try to talk a little bit more about Machiavelli next time, because I do want to talk about him, even though I don't like him all that. He's going in the wrong direction. But what is Machiavelli basically saying? Well, he's saying that there is this conflict. Okay, there is social conflict, and what you need if you're going to make a stable state is you need to let it vent somehow. Okay, you got to vent the conflict. Now, there's something importantly right about that, which is that there is a social conflict. Now, the question is whether we're optimistic or pessimistic about the possibility of adequately venting it. Okay, so I guess what I would say is that Machiavelli has a little bit too much optimism about being able to vent away the social war in a way that would create long-lasting stability. I think what we're going to find when we look at this history instead is that every institution that's created to vent the energy of the social war ends up redirecting the social war in a new direction. And the history of constitutions is the history of a series of kludges, none of which adequately vents the social war permanently, but which just moves it around in a different direction. Okay, so we might try to think about this in terms of a trilemma, okay, by which I mean, you know, there's three different horns that you could impale yourself on, and we might try to look at the history of constitutions as the question of when you're about to fall into one horn, you vent it the other way, and you have maybe a generation or so before you're going to hit the other horn, and then you got to change it again. So I would, that would be my difference from Machiavelli, is to say, yeah, Machiavelli, you got the right problem, but in a way you're a little bit too optimistic about the solutions. And so, you know, so one of the things that Machiavelli talks about is, I mean, that's his praise of Rome, is that Rome developed a constitution over time through a series of accidents, right? That created the state that would adequately harmonize the orders of society. Well, I think what we're finding, what we're going to find out as we take a look, is that there is no solution to the problem. There's only the question of how you can roll it down the road a little bit longer. And you know, and there's also the question, like, to say that the Roman Empire collapsed is already to make a kind of tangentious claim. I mean, it's not clear that the Roman Empire objectively really ever ended at any particular point in time. Okay, so we'll think about that when we get to the very end of the sequence and we look at late antiquity. I mean, first of all, there was a Roman emperor until like the 15th century. He was in Byzantium, and second of all, until the 16th century, the Roman Church was the ultimate power. I mean, you know. And so the, you know, the church, what's the difference between the church and Rome? Well, is it the ghost of Rome, as Thomas Hobbes kind of says, you know, or is it just a transformation of the same institution? And there's so whether we see disruption or continuity in the difference between the Roman Empire and its successor polities is, well, we definitely see more discontinuity than the people living at that time themselves did, right? You'd be stunned how late people thought they were still part of the Roman Empire. And there's continuity in monetary systems and all of this kind of stuff that we're going to look at. And so one thing that we didn't talk about today that we'll talk about next time, you know, what's an important part of the basis of the power of the Roman Church? Well, they're the ones who ultimately get to decide who is legitimately born and who's a bastard. Okay, so now it's a kind of funny fact that almost everybody in the European nobility is technically committing incest. So basically, almost for any noble marriage to be allowed, they have to get a dispensation for incest from the Catholic Church. So the Catholic Church, because everybody's doing incest in order to keep power in the aristocracy, they're all doing incest. So basically, the church has to make an exception for every legitimate marriage. Every legitimate marriage is an exception in the law of incest. That's what gives the Catholic Church power over the succession of power within the post-Roman successor polities. Okay, that one we're going to have to look. That is probably what's at stake in the question of the priestly colleges at Rome. So there's a reference in Livy that Numa establishes the priesthoods to make sure that the laws don't get changed by the influx of new people. I would imagine it has to be. This is true for the Oracle of Delphi. Okay, the Oracle of Delphi is where you go if you want to know if somebody's a bastard or not. You ask them. I bet there's a very similar thing happening with the priestly colleges, and that's going to be an issue that we'll look at as we go on. Dave, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, two unrelated points. I was just thinking about what you said about the dispensation, right, that would bless otherwise incestuous marriages for political purposes. It also, on occasion, I don't know this period very well, but gave people an option to get out, right, in the form of an annulment, right? Yes. Like you can go back and look at canon law and say, oops, too few degrees of consanguinity, sorry, this was never a valid marriage, therefore our kingdoms are united and so forth, right? Yes. So there's that. Then the unrelated point, but I was thinking back to the earlier question about prescription in the Sarah's text, and then like something Machiavelli was doing. And, so Sarah's kind of talks about this theme. It's one of several of his themes, and about, sort of at a certain point, you stop inquiring into the crime. You have to cover it up, or you just have to stop looking at it to by someone's conception, make forward progress. But then there's that one passage we read in Machiavelli where he's trying to, sort of rationalize Remus's murder by Romulus, and he talks about it's really not. He's doing very much the opposite, right? There's not a covering up here. He's trying to like sort of turn it into like his own modern reasons of state conception that might justify what would, in individual morality be a crime. But here it's like, no, you actually just have to cut off the rival branches, right? So, yes, awful, but this is what you do to ensure some form of stability. And so it's interesting, there he's very much not taking Livy as a blueprint in the sense described earlier. He's doing his own thing, which I think it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, these are all great points. So we need to think about things in terms of options, right? It matters if you have the option to do something, whether you do it or not. And if we want to think about, options are how you hedge. So a way to kind of rephrase what I was saying earlier about Machiavelli is I don't really think that Machiavelli has this options theory. He has the idea that you can make a constitution that's going to hedge instability without options. Whereas what I would kind of want us to think about is the way that options are necessary to hedge instability, and they create instability of their own in the way that the option of the coin to be exported and melted down as silver is, well, both a hedge against certain kinds of instability and the condition of other kinds of social instability. So we have options on options on options, and the derivatives are where the action is, and there's not any end to. You can always write a derivative on another derivative, right? So there's no end to the process. Yeah, these are great. Anybody else have any last thoughts they want to get off their chest before we wrap up?
Just that the violation of social orders is fundamental for the establishment of hierarchies, and like Machiavelli does not see the violation of Christian principles as in any way in conflict with the establishment of power. And that this is actually kind of what makes Machiavelli really interesting, because there's a component of sarcasm to how he writes. He is intentionally making himself liked and viewed as needed by elites because he's ensuring his own survival in a system in which they have complete control over life and death. So the extent to which he sincerely believes this, or he's writing this in order to ingratiate himself to elites, is another thing that you have to consider. But just this idea that like there are practical draconian measures that have to be taken to maintain power. And if you are going to be a king, if you are going to be at the top of a social hierarchy, that there are things you have to do to maintain that. And that means violating the fundamental social order. It means treating your brother the way you're never supposed to treat your brother. It means doing to your sister what you are never supposed to do to your sister. Then it means violating the land and the rules of hospitality and shared space. Like that all of these things are necessary in order to maintain power. What Machiavelli takes for granted is that the hoarding of power is the goal and what creates a stable state. His assumption is that once you have all of the power, you're the one who can leak out these little bits to maintain it. The reality is that when you suck power out of a space, you make yourself extremely vulnerable in a way that Machiavelli wasn't really able to get into, and we can more. And I think that that's where it gets really exciting, is perhaps Machiavelli was aware of this, but had no interest in writing it because he was writing for elites. So we have to consider his audience in that too.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how he sort of, he, in a way, I take the basic, it's interesting. He doesn't have a lot to say about Athens, at least not yet in the parts that we read. But he seems to think, I mean, his model is Venice, which is he says, well, if you just make sure that you separate the nobles and everybody else, and you don't try to get too expansionary, then you can kind of have a stable society, right? I mean, that's kind of his answer. But I think the question that we would want to ask is, okay, I mean, what are the internal contradictions in what Machiavelli is kind of describing as the way that the way that you could have stability if only you would do it. I think there are interesting questions here about geography, which is what Michel Serres starts off with at the very beginning, right? I mean, there are geographical, not every place is the same, and so maybe there's certain things you can do in certain kinds of geographical places that are not as possible in others, right? And this is interesting for Roman history because, as the Romans themselves kind of understood it, they were engaged in the process of permanent defensive expansion because what do? Well, they get across the Alps and they start conquering Europe, and Europe is just one river after another until eventually you get to Russia, and then things, and then you're just into Eurasia, and it goes on forever. And there's no really truly natural boundary that separates you from everything else. And so there's geographical problems about the reproduction and projection of power. These are all interesting things. Okay, I think unless anybody has any last burning thoughts, I think it's kind of time to wrap up. I hope you all find this as interesting as I do. I think we're on to like really interesting stuff. So I'm really excited to see what y'all have to say about this. So for next time, read book 2 of Livy. I'll send this out in an email, but read book 2 of Livy, read the next chapter of Michel Serres, and we'll read some Machiavelli. I'll send out exactly, but we read like 21 chapters today, so I don't know, read like another 21 of them or something like that. I'll send out this email soon, but we'll just keep reading. We'll talk next time. And so 2 weeks from today, same time, so every other week. So 2 weeks from today, Sunday, 1 o'clock, and it's the same Zoom link. So I mean, I'll try to remember to send it out. I'm sometimes, it's hard to remember to send them out every single time. But 2 weeks from today, same time, same place. You know what to read. Really excited to hear what everybody has to say now that you kind of been we've given you the first little step up. So look for these problems as we keep reading and see if you can put them on the table for next time. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody. Well, I'll see you